Hey everyone, it's Moon again. Sorry I've been so quiet behind the scenes lately, but I'm back with a pretty fascinating topic today. We saw with our last video that by using Midjourney, we gained the ability to create images using keywords and databases, so in a way, a dream machine. Now imagine if we could do the same thing, but with film and directly from our minds, instantly. There's more to it, but let me start from the beginning. First, let me clear up some common misunderstandings. Thoughtography isn't the same as spirit photography. There are two kinds of psychic photography. Spirit photography, which was big in the spiritual revivalist of the 1900s, and this is when a spirit or apparition is captured on film, and this can range from a past loved one, a demonic entity, or most popularly ectoplasm supposedly leaving the body. Most skeptics have concluded that these are fakes, and many were made by early darkroom techniques that have existed since the dawn of photography. Could spirit photography be a ploy popularized to prevent us from looking into actual psychic phenomena? I'll play fair here and say that perhaps some of them may be true apparitions, but a large portion of the most famous photos were utilized to label psychics as fakes and phonies. But the truth is, psychic research has been conducted since the early 1900s by scientists all over the world, Japan specifically, and it was just conveniently covered up and nobody really talks about it anymore. The real term is thoughtography, or nengraphy, also called projected thermography. Thoughtography is the ability to make an image appear on a plate or film from the mind instantly. It's also described as the burning of a mental image onto a film or plate. The term was coined by Japanese psychologist Tamakichi Fukurai in the early 1900s, a university professor who was exiled because of his findings. Could it be that he'd proven that psychic phenomena and supernatural powers existed? Moreover, since this power works intelligently in response to the human mind, he named it spirit to distinguish it from mental forces that work mechanically according to the laws of physics. Fukurai worked on the study of clairvoyance and was a psychologist at Tokyo Imperial University. He was born in 1869 in Takayama City of the Gifu Prefecture, and after working his way through Danai High School, he proceeded to the Department of Philosophy at Tokyo Imperial University College of Letters. On the recommendation of psychology professor Motaro Yujiro, he entered graduate school to major in abnormal psychology. This was an area of study of abnormal behavior and special mental states, and Fukurai conducted psychological studies of hypnotic states. A mesmeric state is a specific state of mind that occurs in the subject by giving a series of suggestions through a procedure called saimonyo or saimonjutsu, and it's also known to cause different reaction to various mental and physical activities such as consciousness, movement, memory, and perception that occur in a normal state of mind. The phenomenon of hypnosis itself has long been known to people around the world, but from the late 18th century, scientific hypnosis was first attempted by Austrian Franz Mesmer and was introduced to Japan in the early Meiji era. It is thought that mesmerism could improve memory and make it easier to acquire special abilities, which led to a boom in people's expectations. It actually became a social problem because several practitioners appeared and performed secular hypnotherapy on patients. Article 219 of the Police Criminal Punishment Order of 1908 stipulates those who practice mesmerism without reason shall be detained for 30 days or fined less than 20 yen. That's how powerful this stuff was. They had laws preventing the use of it because it's fake. Why make a law for something that's completely fake? It's not like this is the only scam going around, so I find it interesting that they had an ordinance for this specific scam, if it is a scam. Dr. Kenzo Yamamoto has written extensively on this subject since the early 80s. He's a Japanese parapsychologist and doctor of philosophy. He's the founder of the Hida Fukurai Institute of Psychology, where there is free information for everyone to learn about this lost history. He's convinced that clairvoyance and the founding of photography go hand in hand, and it's only recently in the last 100 years or so that this information has been perceived with ridicule by the universities. Fukurai's work is pretty hard to find, and if it weren't for Dr. Yamamoto's writings, it probably would have been forgotten completely. Many of these works cannot be found by a simple English Google search, although in Japan, he is quite popular in occult circles. Either way, this information hasn't really reached mass attention in a very long time. There are hardly any videos on it for some reason. It wasn't until we were watching a movie, The Endless, which is about a summer camp cult group that essentially had a thoughtography machine that they were using to communicate with the creature on the premise. Anyway, the movie is really weird with some weird pacing, but we saw thoughtography in the scene and it really caught our attention. Well, come to find out, this stuff is very real, and many advanced minds have come to attempt to make this device a reality. But unfortunately, the status quo doesn't really support the idea of ESP and psychic powers, possibly because it would ruin the entire system of our current cosmology. This really gets into mind over matter. Why does mind have some power over matter? Or which came first? Because if matter came first, it means that consciousness is nothing but matter and chemical reactions. But if consciousness came first, then that means all of matter came after consciousness, in other words, spirit. Or as Dr. Yamamoto puts it, the sixth dimensional dialectic, which explains how Dr. Fukurai was allowed to use this spirit to heal sickness and other troubles of patients. With this understanding of forces of nature that are above matter, or just not constrained to the laws of physics, we can imagine an actual practical use of metaphysical forces. Fukurai began experiments that would put these very concepts to the test. These experiments would require someone with great ability to use ESP. Now for some that might sound completely ridiculous, but it's just like an art. Not everyone possesses the ability to draw or paint, or even on the spot for that matter. This ability to perform psychic phenomena on the spot is extremely rare and not a variable that most skeptics are willing to consider, since this would require the utmost focus from the practitioner of psychic powers to not feel nervous or uncomfortable during these tests. If it's so easy, why are you nervous, some might ask? Well, it's not easy, and it's not like these movies where you just see things flying around. These forces are either very subtle, or perhaps our ability to sense them has greatly diminished. The skeptics' doubt in the experience are variables or forces that not only can influence the result but constrain it. But the medium must be stress-free and have the utmost focus when performing these exercises. When dealing with these lab-based experiments and dealing with mental psychic forces, we must consider that the skeptic or educated professors from these universities are performing their own mental magic when attempting to disprove psychic phenomena. There is a possibility of error due to the molding and constraining of these forces to prove that they exist by these educated professors from the universities. If we're dealing with an art that relies on mental powers of thought, don't you think that the power of the observer, who probably has their own thoughts, would be a variable? It's a variable that every mental and psychic experiment must consider. The psychic that Fukurai worked with was Ikuko Nagao, who was a clairvoyant with great talent for these beginning experiments in nanography. Ikuko was born in 1873 and was the wife of Yokichi Nagao, who later became the steward of the Viscount of Motohide Mori. Her mother, Sadako, was a feudal retainer of the Heike clan, and when she was at the Mori's family moon viewing party, she was asked to write a waka poem where it impressed the Viscount Mori so much that she received an award. In 1909, her husband began practicing as a lawyer in Utsunomiya City, and he somehow knew that there was going to be a big fire in that very city. Ikuko's daily life consisted of waking up and making offerings to the gods every morning. She would close her eyes and pray for 30 minutes every day. So there you go, this is a mental practice of controlling the mind, and she shows that she possessed great focus to wake up every day and pray to the gods. Now, imagine how modern scientists would not even consider this to be a variable in the experiment, showing their complete lack of understanding of their phenomena. Around this time, Shizuka Mifune's clairvoyance became famous and well known around Japan. She was widely known by all the university professors for her skills in ESP, even Dr. Fukurai was amazed. Since the time when I began to research the psychic force of this medium, I have been quite convinced of her ability as a genuine fact. It is, however, reasonable for the scientists in general to doubt the new fact, never to be understood by established scientific conception. This is a crazy story, but just listen to this. Shizuka Mifune, born in 1886 in the Kumamoto prefecture, was said to be a clairvoyant due to her excellent skills in psychic clairvoyance. Born to the second daughter of a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, just after elementary school, she married an army infantry lieutenant but soon got divorced. Fukurai describes her as a religious spirit and that she was a believer in the I Ching. Many of Fukurai's works in English do not translate accurately, so we must always be mindful when reviewing these works that there was an effort to erase all of this completely. The story goes that she learned about her clairvoyant powers under the guidance of her sister's husband, Takeo Kiyohara, who was interested in hypnotism. Because of this, he was able to see through the seabed of Ariki Sea and discover the Manda pit with remote viewing. Somehow, the word got out around Japan of her abilities, because I was wondering how these university professors in Japan even heard about this random clairvoyant if it's all just trickery. And how did she become famous? They don't really explain that, but after some digging, what we do know is that during the Russo-Japanese War 1904, Shizuka was used as a military asset. Takeo Kiyohara, her brother-in-law, had been engaged in studying hypnotism in Kumamoto City since 1903. He hypnotized Shizuko and placed her in a state of trance and suggested to her that she was a clairvoyant, or this is what Fukurai suggests. She could guess where the soldiers would be moving and what happened to them, and this aroused great attention because it was precisely as she described it. It's interesting because Fukurai talks about how she would have trouble with experiments in some cases because of family issues or something bothering her mind, which is yet another variable in these experiments. Her brother-in-law Kiyohara made a suggestion, saying whenever one succeeds in expelling from one's mind all thoughts and images, and to concentrate all one's spiritual energy by means of a series of deep breathings, one is able to ascertain intuitively all things. He was teaching her how to take deep breaths and focus on removing all thoughts from the mind. This was crucial to successful experiments, but it was no easy task. Try it for yourself. Sit and try not to think one thought for 5 minutes. It's pretty impossible for the untrained mind. Now, imagine some older scientist demand that you prove your ability on the spot while they conduct all these weird tests. Try not to have a single thought in that situation. Kiyohara conducted many experiments to test Shizuko's ability as if she was just his test subject. We never really hear her side of the story. But she would be given 3 sheets of paper. The first he wrote a sentence, the second a proverb, and the third a verse, the words which would be completely forgotten by him, so that it was randomized to a certain degree. They were folded and then cut into 6 leaves, and each put into an envelope. She would have to guess the letters and meanings of the sheets. The first 2 answers were precise, and the last was correct in meaning, but the letters were different. She also used this ability to help people find lost rings and diagnose conditions of patients. Interesting the subject of rings, we found that the character Shizuko Yamamura, Sadako's mother, was supposedly inspired by Shizuko. And this is a film that's main plot focuses on a spirit trapped in a videotape. We'll come back to this because the entire film is talking about these exact events. This eventually led her to be discovered by these professors in Japan, such as Kinoshita Hiroji, the General Secretary of Kyoto Imperial University, and also Fukurai at Tokyo Imperial University. Later, Shizuko went to Tokyo in September 1910 and experimented with clairvoyance in front of 9 doctors from the University of Tokyo's Humanities, Medicine, and Science departments, so clearly they were taking this very seriously. It's said that she earned 20 million yen with her power, that they were using her abilities at hospitals to diagnose patients by seeing into the human body and looking into the organs to locate the issue. In April of 1910, he started full-scale experiments and skill development guidance with his fellow researcher Shinichi Imimura, a doctor of medicine at Kyoto Imperial University. As a result, the two were convinced of the certainty of clairvoyance and reported it to the academic society. Also, on April 25th, a newspaper article at the time made a big deal about the appearance of a woman reading a business card in a sealed box in Kumamoto. In response, Kenjiro Yamakawa, Doctor of Science at Tokyo Imperial University, showed a particularly strong interest and proposed a scientific verification. A public experiment was conducted, but sadly, Shizuko Mifune committed suicide due to her exhaustion and declining ability. I find it interesting that this happens in another instance with Dr. Yamakawa later in the story. The idea is that she did this because she couldn't handle public opinion, but just imagine the amount of stress and pressure and everyone demanding that she must prove her ability. The military and big corporations wanting to use her for her power of war and fighting hidden mines. Of course she couldn't handle it, you know? It seems like a very transitional period in Japan's history where, after the reset, these professors were westernized and they were trying to control the narrative and prove that these things exist when these ancient families in Japan with these abilities have known about these powers for generations. They don't need some university professor to tell them that's true. I mean, why would such a young woman at 24 drink poison and kill herself? Interestingly, she drank potassium dichromate, an early chemical solution that was used in photographic plates. It's obvious that she truly did impress Fukurai and other professors. It was the world that wasn't satisfied with the results. Would they ever be? Considering the main goal of skeptics is to utterly disprove this phenomenon, these skeptics are performing their own magic, an ESP, which is worthy of being their own variable in this experiment. Shizuko, in the modern day, is known as a fake clairvoyant, although this has never been proven. Popular animes like to take a final stab at her to remind everyone that these psychics were all just fake. Regardless, Shizuko is directly responsible for the boom of the study of clairvoyance in Japan during the early 20th century. Many psychics came forward to be tested during this Meiji period, which interestingly, this was a time that Japan was going through radical changes and becoming westernized. Not only that, but there are many old world buildings from this late 1800s period that don't exactly fit the narrative that we're being told. Even these professors look a little strange in their uniforms that so many of these photos have. Why is everybody wearing the same outfit? Also, they seem to all have mustaches. Take a look at this Tokyo Imperial University picture. We'll have to be studying the architecture for another video, but I thought it was strange that the front entrance is completely different than the rest of the building. It just looks like the door to a castle, and the rest of the building is just regular brick. Almost as if to show that this building has ancient ancestry. Why would they have buildings like this in Tokyo during this time period? Many psychics came forward, but Fukurai was most interested in Ikuko Nagao. She had the determination to come forward, they say, after she read the local newspaper about Miss Mifune. At first, they concluded that she was inferior to Shizuko in terms of ability. So think about that. This means that something was definitely weird with Shizuke. How could she have been the standard of psychic phenomena if it didn't exist? Why are they comparing them then? Even if it is just luck, Shizuko possessed the ability to get the highest percentage of accuracy on these tests. Apparently her talent is unmatched, being that she was used for the standard of comparison for future ESP experiments. These professors at Tokyo Imperial University started using undeveloped photographic plates as a mean of proving clairvoyance, where they would send these letters that were written on black paper wrapped in tin, sealed in an envelope in a box where there would be multiple witnesses, because there were other professors present, such as Shuntai Kukichi, Dr. Imamura, Mr. Okokichi, Mr. Kawasaki, and Dr. Fukurai would all be present during these experiments. Dr. Fukurai considered Miss Shizuko the pioneer of clairvoyance, and Miss Ikuko was a pioneer of thoughtography. The first experiments with Mrs. Ikuko Nagao began when Dr. Fukurai learned of Mrs. Nagao from the studies of the head professor at Marugame Middle School, Mr. Shuntai Kikuchi, who was convinced of the abilities of Ikuko. Dr. Fukurai proposed an experiment where he would write down 3 letters on thick leaf paper covered in tin, placed in an envelope on the seam of which adhesive plaster was pasted, as well as his private seal was stamped on the plaster. These first tests were on October 23, 1910, just to test Nagao's clairvoyant abilities. There was an issue. Ikuko made a great point that if she was attempting to guess what was in the private seal, never view the answer, and just send it back, then these college professors could just say, oh, she was wrong, and she would never have any proof herself whether she actually did accurately use her powers, and even if she did tamper with it, the seal would be broken, and that would be apparent. So under these conditions that Mr. Kikuchi would watch over, they performed the experiment, and she answered it perfectly after performing her ritual to Amaterasu, a small silence in which she would pray and focus, empty her mind, and then give the answer to what was in the envelope. Fukurai was impressed, but still, to be scientifically certain, he would need to be there for the experiment so that there was no question that nothing had been tampered with. In November of 1910, Dr. Fukurai and Dr. Imamura went to Marugame to conduct more experiments with Nagao in the presence of 7 other professors. They tested her rigorously. The first experiments on the 12th of November involved writing some letters on a sheet of paper on the table, then set it into a box in the middle of the room labeled E. It would then be brought to room A, a good distance away, where the experiment would be tested by the medium. Mr. Ono was to be placed in room A to watch the psychic perform the ritual, but the medium said she would feel electrified if this man was just standing behind her, staring at her as she attempted to use her clairvoyant powers. Dr. Fukurai agreed to and moved Mr. Ono to room F, where he would watch the letters written, sealed, and placed in the box. Fukurai was nominated to perform the first test. He wrote 3 letters on a sheet of paper, folded it, and then put it into a small ebony box. It was brought to the other room, where she performed the ritual. She whispered her prayer and then gave her answer, and she was correct. The experiment was again performed with Dr. Imamura, and her answer was still correct. This time, it would be tried with Mr. Akochi, with the same conditions, but this time, the medium agreed to allow Akochi to be seated with this object in its place. She would take her deep breaths and pray after giving her answer, and yet again she was correct. Interestingly, they began to get more advanced with the experiment. They got 50 white blank sheets of paper, and on each of them were written 3 letters, chosen out of a collection of 1,000 letters, named Senjumon. They also collected many items for her to guess randomly, but it became difficult for her to succeed. After further experiments, it was shown that she possessed a great ability with the writing method because it allowed her to focus on thought being produced rather than guessing through a collection of hundreds of objects. She was correct in multiple experiments, but in others she would have difficulty. It was first suspected that Ikuko Nagao was a fraud because she had difficulty with some of the more advanced experiments, but during an experiment on December 26, 1910, he discovered an unprecedented phenomena of what he called thoughtography. It was an accident that caught the entire family and Professor by surprise. He actually couldn't believe it, and he thought he was dreaming. 1. A letter pictured on an undeveloped plate would be placed in an envelope and kept at Kikuchi's house and not be brought to Nagao until the experiment was closed. 2. After finishing the experiment, he should open the envelope to see if the answer was correct. And then 3. Finally, it would be sent immediately to Tokyo. If the medium can't see the letter on the undeveloped plate, the only solution is clairvoyance. It also dispels the doubt that the medium would remove the covering to view the contents. What he did was take 2 pictures of 3 letters of Yatenshell under the same conditions, so, essentially, Fukurai took both of these pictures, one is immediately developed and he kept it, and the other is undeveloped. It was wrapped completely so no light could get in and sealed in an envelope within a pasteboard box. This is then given to Professor Kikuchi, who would be the witness, and to everyone's surprise, the clairvoyant successfully used her powers to see the letters. Even though the plate of the letters in the envelope were undeveloped and invisible to the human eye, this could be used to disprove skeptics who are doubtful of these experiments. No one could say that she was just looking at the contents now. They had to develop the plate in order to get the answer. This led to the first experiments in thoughtography. To Fukurai's surprise, when he took the photo to the studio, he compared the one that was already developed to his undeveloped one that had been near Miss Nagao during her clairvoyant experiment. He came to realize that comparing photo B, which had been stored in his house and already developed, with photo A, which had been with Miss Nagao at the time of the experiment, that in photo A, there was some strange light fogging around the original letters. Photo B, which was already developed and with him the whole time, did not have these abnormal artifacts. He attempted the experiment again, but this time, he waited to develop both photos so that they could be developed at the same time. One photo would stay with him, and the other would be sent to the Nagao household under the watch of Mr. Kikuchi and the professors from the university. The psychic would try to see through the box, into the envelope, and see what the letters were. He discovered that it was not the studio process that created the light fog artifact because of this time. He developed them at the same time. Only the undeveloped plate that had been near the psychic at this time of the experiment produced the light fog. It was this insight by Dr. Fukurai that led to the discovery of the first psychic transfer or thoughtography experiment. These first experiments captured the powers of clairvoyance being used, or nensha. He discovered that when developing some of these photos, there would be no explanation on how some of the plates used in the experiments would be overexposed, which we'll come to in detail later in the video. These plates, kept with him in the studio, would be perfectly readable, but after getting the plates back from the experiment, still sealed and everything, meaning no one had seen them yet, after developing them, he discovered that there was some exterior force influencing the exposure of the plate. He concluded that the plates were being exposed by her psychic force. His theory was that if this was some sort of force emitted from the medium, then everything within that radius must be affected, meaning all the plates facing her were the ones receiving this force of light from her pineal gland. He called this local exposure, where if there were multiple plates, were they placed all around, the plates right in front of her received most of the spiritual exposure. Fukurai knows this sounds crazy, saying, "Though such a conclusion was deemed extravagant from the scientific point of view within those days, I was willing to conduct experiments under such a hypothesis." On December 26, Fukurai left at 11 in the morning to pick up a dozen plates at the Ishikawa photo studio, and picked one out of them wrapped in black paper and put it in a pasteboard box. It was kept in a double box under the watch of Mr. Nagao. He wrote the character for heart on a piece of paper and asked Miss Nagao to think of it by copying it. Mrs. Nagao stared at the character for a while, closed her eyes, and thought about it wholeheartedly. And she would pray to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and call her name 3 times. Ikuko did not know the letter, but she impressed her spirit onto the plate. After sealing the box and leaving the house, after developing the photo, the letters were not present, but it definitely captured something which Fukurai called local exposure. This was the first scientific experiment of a transfer of thought or the ability to perceive it in some physical way. On December 27th, he prepared 2 plates, put them in a pasteboard box, and went to the Nagao house. He placed the box in room E, he greeted his friends, and then proceeded to take one of the plates out for the trial, and the other one would be wrapped in a cloth wrapper and left in room B, hidden underneath the hat, lest it should be visible from the outside. There was a sliding door between rooms A and B, and the box was visible to Dr. Fukurai from the room A. He wrote a black round figure on a piece of paper, which was pasted on the lid of B, and put on a box on the table. Mrs. Nagao began to focus with all her intent on this form of a black round figure. Sure enough, when Dr. Fukurai developed the photos, the plate that was wrapped up and kept away from the subject showed no signs of any exposure. However, the one placed into a box and then placed in front of her, she was concentrating and visualizing on this form, produced an exposure artifact that matched the given prompt. For the next experiment, he drew a black square, and she would visualize this object and focused her nensha or spirit projection onto the plate in the box in front of her. He found that when he developed the photos, the exposure would match the description, and so a black square was visible on the developed plates that had been in front of her localized exposure. This experiment was then repeated, but this time with a cross. He had several witnesses from the university take part, and they felt that there was no way that Mrs. Nagao could have tampered with this experiment. The next series of events took place on the 29th of December. Dr. Fukurai prepared 3 plates. They had planned to get her to visualize a black square, 2 letters, and a round black figure. But when beginning, Mrs. Nagao asked if she could start with the letters, not the squares. He agreed, and she began to focus on the letters within 30 seconds. And she'd finished projecting her thoughts and said, "Okay, it's done. My spirit is now on the plate." She then did the same procedure for the black circle. To their astonishment, the plates had clearly been influenced by her thoughts, even though it was sealed in a box and the location was kept hidden from her in different trials. The black circle also came out clearly. Interestingly, Dr. Fukurai mentions that, as they were developing the photos, a suspicious-looking man had broken into the photo room at Ishikawa Photo Studio. They never found out who he was, but obviously people were interested in finding out what these guys were looking into. Later on, a porter by the name of Sanuki Jitsugyo Shimbun aimed to find the secret of thoughtography, which he claimed was just a trick. In those days, the results of thoughtography were so marvelous that almost all men of learning doubted its truth, and many were envious of Dr. Fukurai's discovery, leading to a series of journalists spreading propaganda and lies that thoughtography must be some trick without properly even reviewing the experiments. This journalist, Miyai, was deceived by the propaganda, and so he harbored doubt that the author must have been doing some sort of trick in the darkroom when the photos were being developed. To Dr. Fukurai's surprise, he snuck in to expose this trick, but against his expectations, he discovered that there was no trick, only that there were clear exposure of the letters and the round black figure. Even the biggest skeptic could not find any suspicious work in the development process. After developing the photos from a recent experiment, Fukurai examined the letters and he noticed that they were not ordinary letters but consisted of only outlines and vacant faces. He called Mrs. Nagao to tell her the results and to hear her thoughts. She said that when doing the visualization, she imagined it just as an outline of letters, thinking it would be more beautiful that the thoughtography of the medium would not always be an exact replica of the given model, in this case the letters. Dr. Fukurai agreed with her, and they prepared for the next set of experiments, concluding the 1910 tests. During this time, there were countless attacks on the professor. Here's a newspaper report for an observer who had attended the experiment. From the point of view of the outsider, it may be incomprehensible that the film was stolen, and it may be difficult to understand the reason why such tampering was done. But an investigation of the circumstances in detail from various points show us that it was reasonable, because there were those at Marugame who were trying to expel Dr. Fukurai from the city by delaying and hindering the experiment of whose purpose would be attained if they succeeded in causing the doctor to go away from Marugame. The experiments continued on July of 1911, and on the 22nd, a very clear picture of Kwanjian from a fine scroll was given to them. This is one of the best examples of thoughtography done by Fukurai, because it shows that there was no real way to cut and copy the exposure. It was a detailed image of an actual person. There were also the characters that came out printed on the 24th that were much different than past versions. These were met by the skeptical remarks of Mr. Fuji and his associates, who claimed that thoughtography must be made by casting light upon the plate, breaking through a hollow cut in the shape of a letter or something, like pasteboard. It supplies good evidence and ground for this conclusion that there was no isolated hollow in the print of thoughtography. So, as long as it is impossible to cut out shape of the letter with an isolated hollow in the pasteboard, it is also impossible to produce a print having an isolated hollow by casting a light breaking through the feature of the letter cutout in the pasteboard. Dr. Fukurai says that this logic was used based on denial, as there were no isolated hollows used in obtaining the letters in thoughtography. He breaks their reasoning, as they used letters in Greek fret, having many isolated hollows that would solve the issue of this being cut out. She had a strong fight to want to prove the existence of this phenomena, despite the strong agnostic criticism coming from the media. Right before her death, Mrs. Nagao promised Kenjiro Yamakawa, Doctor of Science, a Yale-educated physicist, the former president of Tokyo Imperial University, to try an experiment in thoughtography on a plate to be offered to him. The day of the experiment was appointed for January 8th. Yet many of the professors participating in the experiment had already concluded that thoughtography was some fake trick before even beginning the experiment, putting a lot of pressure on Ikuko. Dr. Fukurai gladly accepted Dr. Yamakawa's offer, as he was the authoritative senior in the world of physics in Japan, and was also a world-recognized man of honor. The issue was that they tried to find professors who would come to these experiments with an open mind, but the truth is that all the physicists at the time were so narrow-minded and dogmatic in their ideas. But for Dr. Yamakawa, it seems that Dr. Fukurai trusted him. But at the end of the experiments, Fukurai called it preposterous, and was astonished at Dr. Yamakawa's actions. He wanted to warn future students of the physical problems of these types of experiments and what was done to the physicists of Japan. This whole Dr. Yamakawa experiment was set up by Mr. Noriatsu Fuji, who had been one of the biggest skeptics of the experiment since they started gaining attention. Yamakawa was the lead professor at Tokyo Imperial University, and began his plan with Fuji to debunk thoughtography once and for all, to finally prove that it was a trick before even beginning the experiment, which only shows that they had already made up their minds and had no real interest in learning anything about these experiments. The model for the thoughtography experiment was to be the letter for the strong and healthy. It was wrapped up and placed in a pasteboard box as usual, then further closed in a wooden box. Dr. Yamakawa would take this box to Nagao's house personally with the box in this bag. This ended up being a failed attempt, but it was almost as if they planned it on purpose. After setting up a character for the thoughtography experiment, Mrs. Nagao, under immense pressure of having her entire family's legacy and honor humiliated, had to prove her abilities to this university head with a suit and tie. Otherwise, Dr. Yamakawa and Mr. Fuji the journalist were going to tarnish their family name. As Dr. Fukurai suggested earlier, Mr. Fuji from the start had claimed that thoughtography was simply a trick without properly witnessing the experiment. Even after being given access to the darkroom studio and the ability to participate in the experiment, Mr. Fuji never intended on discovering the truth. Mr. Fuji had come to the room of the experiments and proposed multiple theories on how the thoughtography trick can be performed. Number 1, there was some sort of duplicate key that would swap the plate with another. Number 2, the bag would be opened and a light given to the plate with the pattern cut out to create a cast, breaking the wrapper or plate. Number 3, without opening the bag, X-ray or radial rays may have been given over a metal pattern under the bag. Number 4, the holder of the box containing the plate would be able to make an exposure by casting radial rays through a pattern cut into the feature and kept in his breast. To satisfy Mr. Fuji's concerns, the metal clasp with the capsule of the bag should be made of black with the smoke of smoldering oil, so if anyone opens the bag, it would be easily found by the disappearance of the black color, because the fingers would remove the color of the clasp. Next, a fine manganese line should be set in a black wrapper covering the plate. A disappearance or break in the line would make it clear that a third person had opened the covering. Even if X-rays or radial rays were given to the plate through this wrapper by a third person, a shadow of the fine line of the plate would expose the fraud. Third, 2 Leyden crosses should be placed, one under the wooden box and the other above the pasteboard box. In this condition, if any shadow of the cross could be printed on the plate besides the letter, it may be judged that a third person must cast X-rays or radial rays upon the plate. This satisfied both Dr. Yamakawa and Mr. Fuji, and they continued on with the experiment. But Mrs. Nagao began to feel extremely pressured because her family honor was on the line. She began to pray before the experiment that her family wouldn't be disgraced and that she would perform successfully. This meant a great deal to her, not just because of the fame, but because they had no other choice. Mr. Fuji was planning on destroying their family name, so she had to prove her abilities. She gave it her all, but she sensed that something was wrong. She left the room in a strange fashion, and after discussing with Fukurai, she said that something was wrong and that she felt that Dr. Yamakawa was attempting a ruse. She couldn't sense the plate at all, and she felt a bad aura about Dr. Yamakawa, as if they were planning on making them fail no matter what. She thought that he'd even removed the plate and placed it somewhere else. They came back to the room and confronted Dr. Yamakawa, and he reassured them that the plate was indeed in the bag. After some discussion, Dr. Yamakawa decides to look in the bag and finds that there is no plate. They could also see that all the precautions that they had set up to prevent fraud had been broken by someone. Someone had purposely opened the bag. After the doctor finished explaining, Mr. Fuji, the journalist, ran out of the house in a very strange fashion. Everyone looked in astonishment, asking where he was going. Even Mrs. Nagao asked, "Why did he run away?" Dr. Yamakawa answered and said it was Mr. Fuji who put the plate in the bag. Maybe he was unsure about what happened and went to go check. While all this confusion was occurring, Mr. Fuji returned and told his associate to tell Dr. Yamakawa the following message. "The plate is at the other place. I thought I put it in the pasteboard box, but now I find that I was mistaken. Tell this to Dr. Yamakawa." So he didn't even come back in. He just sent a message later saying, "Hey, sorry, yeah, I left it at the other place and forgot to put it in." So either he really just wasn't taking it seriously, or they just didn't want this experiment to succeed under any circumstances. Dr. Fukurai was shocked by this irresponsible behavior, without even an apology, and his carelessness had caused the entire Nagao family great stress, as they truly wanted to participate in the experiments, so that they could clear their name from the nasty articles that Mr. Fuji had been publishing in the newspapers. Afterwards, Dr. Yamakawa apologized, but they knew that this whole experiment was just a way for Mr. Fuji to interview them and write whatever he wanted. Fuji ended up publishing a small article, The Report of the Experiment in Clairvoyance, on the 15th of February, where he announced to the public in detail his own opinions. This work set out to disgrace Miss Nagao as a psychic, and in response, Mr. Nagao became very angry, and on June 16 he responded. "My opinion of the experiments of Dr. Yamakawa. With the malicious design of giving a bad name to the psychic force of Mrs. Nagao, Dr. Yamakawa and his follower on the plea of an experiment undertook to question the fact of her ability. The very facts of the seal of the bag and losing the Leyden cross were brought forward by themselves, and they sought to disgrace Miss Nagao. The main point of this rebuttal was that everything was set up to prevent interference had been broken, so Mr. Fuji must have taken the plates out later, realizing that if they proved him wrong under his own conditions, that they would have to start taking thoughtography seriously. So they ditched the test and claimed that it was inconclusive when they never even tried. The worst part is that even though he got caught opening the bag, instead of admitting to it, he never says it directly, but he insinuates that Mrs. Nagao was the one who opened it, making her the fake, even though Mr. Fuji was the one who ran out of the room. In short, these early experiments on thoughtography and Nensha were put to a stop because after this event, the Nagao family was so disrespected by Mr. Fuji that they never wanted to do any experiments ever again. After being persuaded by Dr. Fukurai to do one last experiment, in the presence of newspaper reporters to clear their name, they agreed, and after performing the experiment, the day after someone came and stole the undeveloped plate by an unknown visitor of the Nagos. And also what was found was a brief note threatening the Nagao family. Not long after, Mrs. Nagao died of illness. It came that Mrs. Nagao had reported these letters for Mr. Fuji in clear detail, but Mrs. Nagao started to become sick. After Dr. Fukurai had early photographs stolen and Mrs. Nagao passed away from illness, the experiments came to a close. An interesting detail to note about these two psychics is that they were both brought to their deaths under the experiments of these educated men at Tokyo Imperial University. Speculation goes that from the beginning, Mr. Fuji wanted to tamper with the bag and had control of all of the materials. Fuji had basically crafted this experiment as a trap, hiding numerous Leyden crosses, lines of manganese, and the smoke of smelting oil on the bag to ensure that any tampering by a third party would be made apparent. And sure enough, in addition to the lack of much-needed photographic plate, there was indeed evidence that someone had tampered with the bag, though it was all very inconclusive and questionable. This led Nagao to distrust Fuji's physician-prescribed disoxins, and Fuji likewise to distrust Nagao's abilities. Somehow or another, the Nagao family was allowing these physicians to drug the medium or even the whole family. The Nagaos absolutely refused to conduct any further experiments with Yamakawa or Fuji ever again, and the Fujis published an article on February 15th, publicly denouncing Nagao's thoughtography as little more than sleight of hand. After looking more into this, it became clear that not only Mifune, but the Nagao families were both suspicious of these physician-prescribed disoxins. Methamphetamines or ADHD medicine that were given to these patients. Really strange because they were trying to make them hyper-focused, which also makes me think that they really didn't have much of a choice. They were drugged by Dr. Fukurai, which brings us to question even him. Of course, he is a foundation in the research of parapsychology and these early tests on Nensha, but I even think that he truly believed in the phenomenon himself. His work Clairvoyance and Thoughtography in 1913, he declares in a defiant tone, "Despite swarms of academic opponents in front, I declare that clairvoyance is real, and so is thoughtography." Yet, even if this is the case, he was connected with all these westernized, educated professors and universities. He got these psychics famous, and the story goes, with the movie The Ring, it's the same thing. The newspaper brought these psychics up just to tear them down. We must always consider that Fukurai's work will always be appreciated, but we can't rule him out just yet as not being a part of this whole story of the suppression of ESP. His work changed from this point on, began to study other psychics such as Miss Tetsuko Moritake, Miss Sadako Takahashi, whose works did impress Fukurai, but there was no one else to really witness the work, so it just became more documentation. This is when Fukurai's work starts to become more like a seance, where Mrs. Sadako had multiple personalities and would essentially become possessed by one of her split personalities, making his work more theatrical. But still, there's some interesting results from these later experiments. After Mrs. Nagao's death, she was followed by Miss Tetsuko Moritake, who had demonstrated skill in the experiments by using clairvoyance with letters. Using Leyden pipes that were soldered, the experiments were completely successful. Moritake successfully performed these experiments on photogenic plates producing similar forms such as the black figure and a few letters. On the last character, Dr. Fukurai noticed that some marks looked like it was made by a finger, and he asked the medium of what her thoughts were. She said she was visualizing the model given to her on a sheet of paper. It began to fall, and so she picked it back up, so it would stay in place. This is the plate that was sealed in a box. This was just a visual she was using to memorize the copy onto a plate. It also transferred that she had touched the paper to pick it up, and that it manifested in the thoughtography plate, according to Dr. Fukurai. The next medium was Mrs. Sadako Takahashi. She was the daughter-in-law of Shirazo Nagase, and a descendant of Lord Motsumasa. She had been blessed with strong religious beliefs in childhood. She had never forgotten to worship Saint Nichiren and her ancestors every morning. Since the appearance of this psychic force, she became much stronger in her belief. Dr. Fukurai discovered that Sakura Takahashi had a split personality, one calling itself a long-nosed goblin, and the other Saint Nichiren. This was a similar concept to the devil and angel on the shoulder that we have in the West. She had a separate personality or other version of herself that she communicated with, and this was split into two, the goblin and Saint Nichiren. Saint Nichiren is a controversial figure of his own. His contentious teaching stated that basically anyone could become a Buddha, even the ignorant and evil people. Sort of reminds me of the beliefs of the Nicolaitans. She would receive advice from these two figures during the experiments, and she also described them as her guardian spirits. Fukurai noticed that anxiety was a constant variable in these experiments, and in one case with Takahashi, she was asked to perform an experiment in front of a group of established scientists, but she declined. Fukurai concluded that this was because she was aware of the decline of her faculties. But overall, he still believed in her and pushed her to attempt another experiment. After discussion, she began to change her personality, and the long-nosed goblin took over and began speaking through Sadako. In one of these experiments, someone made a remark to the goblin in a very rude way, and not long after, Mrs. Sadako began to have a very high fever. Dr. Fukurai believed that the goblin was staging a scene in order to make him consent to the condition proposed by himself for the method of experimentation on thoughtography. Fukurai said that his reasoning was because the medium had already shown a habit of going feverish when receiving a spiritual shock. Therefore, he just wanted to verify that the influence was accurate for the experiments. He decides to go visit her in her bed with the fever, and he said that he'd never seen such depression before in spite of the fever. As he was watching her, her personality changed, and the goblin appeared. The goblin said, "You are anxious about the fever, are you not?" The goblin made a deal with Dr. Fukurai that instead of performing the experiment in front of men of learning, that on the request of the professor, he would control the fever and lower the temperature in an instant. Dr. Fukurai had been observing her sickness, and she had a clinical thermometer that rose beyond 42 degrees Celsius, where the mercurial line rose all the way to the top of the glass duct. Therefore, this goblin, whether it was a guardian spirit or a demon or a subconscious projection, had the ability to alter Sadako's body temperature in under 2 minutes. On May 7, 1911, she experimented with psychic photography for the first time under the guidance of Mr. Miyaji Takahashi. At the time, she was copying the cross. After that, she copied the letter Sa on the second time, the shape of a cloud on a moon on the third time, and the character of Ishin on the fourth time, all of which were successful. Dr. Fukurai then would hypnotize Mrs. Takahashi. They would drug and put these clairvoyant mediums into a trance basically, and then in these states of consciousness, the psychologist would communicate with their subconscious, or in this case, what he believed to be a guardian spirit. One could say that Dr. Fukurai's work became theatrical and similar to the Western idea of possession from demons, but it also seems at this point Dr. Fukurai had lost all interest in trying to stay within the constraints of how these educated professors viewed reality. He was willing to try anything at this point, or be completely open-minded since he had already been torn down by the media. So he would continue to see where these experiments would lead him, without passing judgment or trying to prove it to the university since they really wanted no part. The guardian spirit gave Dr. Fukurai this message. In tonight's experiments, among Nichiren, the mystic law and the Dharma, the two characters of the mystic law have most profound meaning, so copy them. When transcribed, do not use the two characters of mystic law at once. I will give each character twice, so copy them twice. First, put out the character of Mio, after copying it, and then put the character of the law. That's another test. Dr. Fukurai proceeded to copy it twice. When the guardian spirit withdrew and reverted to her lady's personality, she seemed to have awakened from a deep sleep, completely ignorant of the Tengu's warnings. So I passed her Tengu's advice to her, and told her that in her experiment that night she would copy two characters of her mystic law. The experiment started around 8:30. The four witnesses were Mr. Yoshihide Kubo, Mr. Minoru Takahashi, Mr. Miyaji Takahashi, and Dr. Fukurai. Mrs. Kubo took a seat at the shrine on her floor, and Mr. Kubo took a seat to the left of her, holding a dry plate. The distance between them was about 4 feet. The lady went into mental unity as she spoke to herself as follows. Mio character came out, law, law. While speaking to herself like this, she tried her best to focus her mind on each letter. She finally said she was in the picture and fell to her right. About 7 minutes and 25 seconds elapsed from the time she entered her mindfulness to the time she said, I got it. So together with Mr. Takahashi and Mr. Kubo, Dr. Fukurai started developing plates in a separate room. After assigning numbers 1, 2, and 3 in order from the nearest to the 3 dry plates, the results were as follows. Number 1, completely insensitive. On the second, numbered dry plate, as shown in figure 31, 2 characters of Miyoho, which are strong writing, appeared in addition to short feather-like objects that appeared in the form of spirals on the entire surface of the dry plate. The third, the plate number 3, was completely insensitive. The experiment on the right proved that Mrs. Takahashi's photocopy was true. Moreover, Dr. Fukurai had been able to ascertain 2 important facts concerning further matters of the psychic photography in general. The first was that a mental transfer can be performed only on the central one of the plates. In other words, the psychic ability of mental copying is spatial transcendence. This experiment was carried out during the time of Mrs. Nagao, but there were some criticisms that the experimental method was not rigorous enough, and there was some doubt. Thanks to Mrs. Takahashi's experiments, it finally became certain. The swirl-shaped feather-like thing that appears on the surface of number 2 is a completely unknown recollection of Mrs. Takahashi. If so, what is this whirlpool a mental copy of? According to what I've researched since then, the image on the right is a mental copy of a guardian spirit, a Tengu. Moreover, according to Tengu himself, a whirlpool is a mental transfer. In short, this experiment, the psychic mesmerized the 2 characters of the mystic law, and at the same time, the guardian goblin mesmerized the feathers on one of its wings. Therefore, psychic copying is not necessarily performed by the psychic's own will, but can be performed by spirits unknown to the medium. So the psychologist could use thoughtography to communicate with a person's demon or guardian angels. In other words, telepathy of the guardian spirit without the psychic's own knowledge in the creation of nengraphy. In 1917, Fukurai published a paper entitled, An Idea is an Organism, Fukurai 1917, which he expressed his belief that the phenomena of thoughtography could not be explained in a way like X-rays or radium emanation. He argued a new theory, ideo-organism. Fukurai's theory consisted of 3 concepts. First, an idea is a demand, meaning that an idea demands self-realization on a substance. Second, an idea is a force. And third, an idea is kusei, meaning emptiness or void, as it is derived from Buddhism. In the second half of the same paper, he presented experimental results with Mr. Koichi Mita, to whom Fukurai paid his highest tribute for having the greatest psychical potential. Mr. Mita was said to express his thoughtographic power during various occasions, including a public experiment in Ogaki. Fukurai first used nengraphy in an English language paper in memory of Mr. Mita after his death. Fukurai renamed thoughtography nengraphy since an idea, kennen or nen in Japanese, was not similar to a thought, and he was unable to translate into English successfully. According to him, the nen cannot be perceived by our senses or organs, but it is possible to act upon the matter in transcendent ways, i.e. possibly beyond the present-day physical laws. Therefore, the accurate name is nengraphy, as it is not a thought that is projected, but an idea with a mental form that had been concentrated on and created out of nen. Mr. Koichi Mita was a well-known clairvoyant long before Miss Chizuka Mifune. However, it was only after the Nagao's experiment that he began experiments on nengraphy. Mr. Mita performed an experiment in 1929 with Fukurai, after the dry plates were sealed in a cross shape and stamped and then put in an office safe, and the key was kept by another witness. Mr. Mita made statements on what he wanted manifested on the plates, describing horses, a portrait of a person, and scenery of a location. But during this 1930 phase with Mr. Mita, we must consider the possibility that this subject matter became hijacked, and that they had incentive not only to make it look less credible, but also to make money off of these subjects. Dr. Mita is responsible for restoring the visions of the souls of the heroes of the underworld, where he produced vivid photographs, although haunting and dreamlike, could be fakes produced by what we now consider shills. They were selling these paintings of these figures because they were worshipped by the public, so they made a lot of money off of these photos, which could really be described as the start of spirit photography. It's not to say that these aren't real examples of nensha, but that we should be critical of these later experiments with Mr. Mita, as he was a college-approved psychic, and there was already an effort to make all of this look unworthy of scientific attention. Some of these may be true examples, as with the portrait of Prince Katsura, but in other cases they produced images that may be questionable, as with the portraits of the immortal souls, and with the later William Hope images. Interestingly, some of these early William Hope images may have been some kind of projection from staring at the camera, but with these last tests during the 1930s, we must be questionable of their validity, as they started to become more like spirit photography rather than the earlier experiments of thoughtography, which all variables were taken with the utmost caution. This is the transition from nengraphy or thoughtography into spirit photography. Now, Dr. Fukurai may not have known that Mr. Mita was a shill, leading him to promote these later experiments and further discrediting his earlier works. Which is strange because Mr. Mita was a psychic who actually worked with NASA and attempted to use thoughtography to take a photograph of the dark side of the moon in 1930. That's 20 years before the Soviet spacecraft Luna 3 sent back the first photo from the dark side of the moon. My conclusions are, 1, that Dr. Fukurai is one of the earliest pioneers of thoughtography and clairvoyance experiments in the history of Japanese psychology, worthy of noting because of the cultural shift that it caused in Japan. On the one hand, we can consider that Dr. Fukurai had true intentions and was being honest that these tests were performed exactly as he described them. But on the other hand, we have to consider whether or not this was part of some sort of cultural and mental reset in Japan's history. As it's said, this was when magic was being destroyed or erased from Japan's history, as in ancient times. The sages, medicine men, and samurais who used this power of nen were the ones with the most respect and notoriety. Then, in the late 1800s, there was a shift, and it all happened with the westernization of these Japanese colleges. Is it possible that Dr. Fukurai may have been a participant in this reset? Whether it was known to him or not, he was a tool of the state and the universities. He'd even argued that they may not even be the true founders of nengraphy, that they'd actually known about this from ancient times, and that this was but a cover-up by the universities to seek out these individuals still holding these psychic abilities, to pick them up, hypnotize them, and use them for whatever experiments and tests they wanted, even military uses, as with Shizuko. And then once they were done with the mediums, they mysteriously died. I mean, these are basically Japanese Montauk experiment projects. Are we not to question all these professors involved? I mean, what was the end result? Psychic research was ultimately banished in Japan, and someone with credentials needed to take the fall, so it would never be researched again. Something that is not always mentioned in the story, but we must consider with our knowledge of history and resets. It's interesting to note that the natives of many cultures considered photos to be spirits being trapped. Therefore, we must take Fukurai's work with great respect, because the reset may have been beyond this knowledge, as he showed great curiosity and was convinced that these early experiments on clairvoyance and thoughtography were proven to be an unquestionable fact. This resulted in Dr. Fukurai to be essentially forced out of the college and fired. Now we need to think of the possibility of a hijack, because although the discovery may have been accidental by Dr. Fukurai, it was then covered up by the universities. This then inspired others to come forward and take this work and use it for fraudulent works, such as Mr. Mita and the moon. Now we get into Ted Sirios, and boy, this is a weird story because unfortunately there is a reason that this stuff is not taken seriously anymore. You'll find that if you type in thoughtography, there are hardly any videos on it, and the ones that do exist don't have a lot of views. And I think that's because in the 1950s and 60s, the occult began to be flooded with propaganda and New Age topics that further proceeded to discredit not only magic, but the experiments on ESP in the early 1900s. These topics were studied by Jewel Eisenbud, which strangely many in the field of psychic research believe to be genuine. But I find that the cases with Ted Sirios to be peculiar and very unscientific. In 1966, a reporter came to investigate one of these thoughtography events by Sirius. He had already been turning this into a stage show. Eisenbud had written about him under the guise of professional scientific research, but it seems more like it was an attempt to make him into a star, like Uri Geller, who also participated in thoughtography experiments in 1995. They were just celebrity plants. These university professors would find subjects or celebrities to be the subject of proving their New Age concepts so that they could become famous for discovering ESP, such as the world of Ted Sirius, 1967. But the Ted Sirius research comes off as trollish, as a reporter describes. 7 guests assembled the evening I was involved, a typical number for a group to witness a demonstration, according to Dr. Eisenbud. Each guest was asked to bring at least 5 rolls of 3000 speed Polaroid film. Dozens of exposures were made in the 2 cameras brought by Dr. Eisenbud. Sirius would hold what he called a gizmo, a black paper tube about 1 inch in diameter and 1.5 inches long, up to the camera lens. Would then scream obscenities, contort his face, and yell "now," the signal for whoever was holding the camera to trip the shutter. He would become quite drunk and obnoxious. Dr. Eisenbud even chastised him often, but the doctor still continued to supply alcohol to Sirius. The frenzy continued. The evening wore on, and still no photographs emerged from the multitude of developed images. Then, amazingly, after 5 long hours, 3 strange images arrived, after 1 minute to process each exposure. Although, with the 2 cameras, he produced 6 blurry images unrelated to the room's environment. I was puzzled. He often displayed the gizmo so we could see that it was empty, but in his drunken state, he finally slipped up. Sirius became careless. As he was waving his arms and yelling, I saw a shiny object reflect from inside the paper gizmo that he had always held up to the camera lens. Who knows if this story is true, but regardless, it's not on the same level of dedication and precision seen in the preparation of earlier experiments by Dr. Fukurai, where we could be sure that there was no tampering that could have taken place under the suppositions he proposed. With Sirius, it kind of makes the whole thing look like a joke. It doesn't matter if some of the images were close or slight variations, or even some of the text came out distorted. Admit that these images are pretty reminiscent of AI, but we can never be certain that Ted was not using some sort of photographic technique at the time of the photo, especially since he also had this mysterious black tube with him while performing this. And why did he have to be drunk? I guess I don't buy it because they make all these documentaries and turn it into entertainment. I find the part with the blackies and whiteys pretty interesting because supposedly under these conditions, either no light was allowed or it was overexposed. Yet regardless of the impressive quality of these photos, this is the age where these topics were becoming hijacked by the mainstream. Eisenbud had interviews with Discovery and History Channel on how he performed these experiments, and the entire thing seems to be a show. Or a setup. Eisenbud was very educated on the occult, but any serious professor would have to remove the alcohol, place Ted Sirius in a position where he was near to the camera but not close enough to touch it with his hands. And during these experiments, his hands must rest by his side to verify that no lens in his hands were placed in front of the camera. None of these variables were really discussed, and Eisenbud abused this to promote his topics on metaphysics that, although were based in truth, used faulty experiments and subjects who were drunk under the influence and brought even further disgrace to the subject of nengraphy. There's a documentary where they've got Ted Sirius as an elderly man to come back to try these experiments again, under the dock crew's conditions. And as you can see, it looks pretty fake, as if he knows that this is just a joke. He screams and grunts at the camera, but fails to do so when the crew is around. So they do this all day and night. He gets drunk, he lost his ability, and then they show you how he does it. So basically the same template. You find a subject you truly do not want researched, let's say a clairvoyant, because remember this all started with local psychics in Japan that were getting famous locally for finding rings and predicting events. These westernized universities came in and were like, oh, we just want to test you so we can prove it to the world. Mediums and their families of these ancient origins agree and become very rich doing so, but to the price that they participated in the process of erasing this knowledge and occult powers in man. The university professors were never satisfied with the experiments, continually making it more and more advanced with further restrictions, which led to the use of photographic plates, because it would be impossible for anyone to know what's on the plate until after it was developed. The mediums then beat them at their own game, realizing that they never had any intention on discovering or proving occult powers. No, it was actually the reverse. They had come to build it up as a stage show, entertainment for the newspapers, just to build it up as a charlatan's trick. This created its media presence so that they could just tear it down. Only in its origin was it genuine. Yet, as we proceed into the next generation, this knowledge became more and more abused by modern professors like Dr. Eisenbud, who created the image of Ted Sirius and promoted his ridiculous performance just so he could get a paycheck, and then tear him down 10 years later. Why else would you agree to doing a documentary where they could say whatever they wanted about you? And even if the Discovery Channel was lying about them using a lens, it's a solid argument. Why is he holding this black tube and yelling? It just seems really strange. And that doesn't mean thoughtography as a whole is a joke. This just means that it's been attacked repeatedly since its inception. In fact, as early as 1893, the famed inventor and innovator Nikola Tesla was talking of this concept. He was toying with the idea of creating a machine that would allow thoughts and images in the mind to be projected onto a device like a television. Tesla would say this of his wild theory: I became convinced that a definite image formed in thought must by reflex action produce a corresponding image on the retina, which may be read by a suitable apparatus. This brought me to my system of television, which I announced at the time. My idea was to employ an artificial retina receiving an object of the image on a screen, an optic nerve and another retina in the place of a reproduction, both being fashioned somewhat like a checkerboard, with an optic nerve being a part of the earth. When we think of proving psychic phenomena, we're usually thinking of some all-seeing psychic who can do it all at any given moment, when in reality it's more often situational. I'm not doubting that there could be psychics who can do it on command with great accuracy, but I think if there were someone like that out there, they'd probably want to remain anonymous so as to either live a normal life and not end up a rablat, or maybe just to hoard their power and take over the world. We wouldn't know. However, I do think that there is a power that anyone can possess. I think it's wired into us, and some people are just more in tune with it than others, but can only access it in specific scenarios. Much like Raven from That's So Raven, or the characters in the Final Destination films. These are examples of psychic abilities manifesting at either random times or right before a disaster. Every religious text has examples of either seeing a vision or getting a vision from a dream, something today that would be considered complete nonsense. It seems to have been totally forgotten about or maybe purposely buried under the guise of safety. I can see how it could cause issues in today's social climate. It just seems like an ability that is so powerful. Like, imagine being able to make any image from your mind or being able to see behind walls. We typically consider a photograph as valid proof of something being a reality, but that all comes to a crash if images from the mind can be produced, just like the modern reality of Photoshop and AI image creation and deepfakes. To add a little bit more details on the influence of thoughtography it has in the media, let's take a look at the Ringu book and films. The entire story of Ringu is based on the events of Sadako's life, the girl with the two personalities and the goblin inside of her. I also think that's worth mentioning that in the original Ringu novel by Koji Suzuki, the character Sadako is characterized as being intersex, having complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, and is supposedly the daughter of Enno Ozunu, a banished shaman who's said to be immortal. In the book, it said that Sadako's mother actually recovered a statue from the ocean that had been tossed away by Americans, and finding the statue was said to be the awakening of her psychic powers. In the Ringu film, one of the main characters, psychically inclined journalist character Ryuji, even implies that the man who raised her wasn't her real father, and that her true father wasn't human at all. I also find it interesting that this ring is connected to smallpox in the book, like it was some psychic virus that was born out of Sadako's hatred for society combined with smallpox becoming the ring virus. The Saturnian symbolism is also very thick in this tale. We've got the black cube, or the television, being the conduit for the spiritual manifestation of death. The ring not only refers to the sliver of light at the top of the well, but the sound of the phone once you've seen the tape. And in the film, Sadako is said to have lived 7 days in the well, connecting to the "you will die in 7 days" theme throughout the movie. In the book, it's said that she lives in there for 33 years, in the well, dying only a year before the events take place in the novel. Pretty interesting number choices. It's hard to believe that someone could live that long in the well, but if she truly was the daughter of an immortal shaman, she could have had otherworldly survival capabilities. Or maybe she switched to the goblin during that time. In the Japanese film, there's this strange thing that Ryuji says to Sadako's father, a rhyme about how if you play in the ocean, the goblins will come and take you away, which is referencing ancient Tengu spirits. I know this all sounds like folklore, and it is in a way, because the events in the book are only based on the life of Sadako. They're not real, as far as we know. But imagine if they were. Don't you think that this would be something they would want to be kept under wraps? Japan has a long, vivid history with the spirit world. Most of these stories live on in books, movies, and anime. I don't think that it's necessarily all fiction. Either way, it's an interesting rabbit hole. And this whole thoughtography thing reminded me of the Season 4 Black Mirror episode titled Crocodile, in which an insurance agent investigates a traffic incident using a device that manifests people's memories. It was called the corroborator, which is described as a brain-scanning device that doesn't require physical implants to work. Instead, it uses a small scanner device that is specifically able to scan memories. The scans are fed to a nearby screen that visualizes them for someone else to view. Now, this machine is a more advanced version of this sort of thing, but it does make me wonder how accurate it could be. As we can see from the thoughtography examples, the details are sometimes foggy or incorrect. I guess it would depend on where it was sourcing the information from, the conscious or the subconscious. You'd think that everything is recorded to some degree in the brain, even if it goes unused. The thought of it is sort of unsettling because even though it could be used to help solve crimes and maybe even replay precious memories, it could also be used to manipulate and hurt people. Just like any tool, I guess. Another interesting example of telekinesis in photography is in the wildly popular manga and anime JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which I highly recommend. There's the character Joseph Joestar, and he has the ability to use thoughtography to locate his enemy. I won't say much else because I don't want to spoil anything, but it is definitely an interesting detail. But by far my favorite example is Saiki K, a character from the manga anime The Disastrous Life of Saiki K, which follows high school student Kusuo Saiki and his struggle with being an all-powerful psychic. It's a slice-of-life comedy story, so it's very different from the exciting and intense experience that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure offers, but it's got a lot of interesting psychic phenomena that usually results in a hilarious situation playing out. Also, Mob Psycho 100 is another really cute anime about a psychic if you're in the market for a new show or comic. And of course, we've got Nen in Hunter x Hunter, and the Gyo. which is an advanced application of Ren, by which a Nen user concentrates a larger than normal portion of their aura into one specific body part, most commonly the eyes, in order to see that which is hidden. In Boruto, the Senrigan is a dojutsu possessed by Ada. Using this ability, Ada can project her consciousness to any location to see and hear any present event, as well as any past event up to the moment of her birth. But yeah, this stuff is very present in Japanese pop culture. It was essentially erased from history of psychology until the early 90s because they could no longer ignore the importance of this event called the Fukurai Affair. Among earlier generations of Japanese psychologists, it has even been too taboo for discussion. Today, the Fukurai Affair and its after effects are considered to have been a major deterrent in the advancement of clinical psychology in Japan during the first half of the 20th century. So what do you think? Do you think the experiments of Dr. Fukurai adequately proves the existence of nensha, or psychic phenomena? Check out the references in the description so you can see the experiments of the mediums in detail. What do you think about Ted Sirios? Do you trust the wave of celebrity psychics that came to prominence in the late 60s? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And I think that we're pretty interested in performing some of these experiments on nungraphy, or if anyone has any early books on the subjects that they would like to share or can assist in any way possible, please reach out. We have an email in the Discord, and this would be amazing if we can rediscover and revive these early arts of thoughtography. So please share with your friends, and all we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?